He flipped through the papers. Tax delinquency notices. Sale documents. Everything looked official, stamped and signed by county offices, but something felt wrong. His grandfather had been many things, but irresponsible with money wasn't one of them. "My grandfather paid his taxes," he said. "He was meticulous about that stuff," Whitmore shrugged. "Maybe he got sick. Maybe he forgot. It happens with older folks. Look, I understand this is emotional, but the sale happened 5 years ago. We've invested $18 million developing this community. The legal period to challenge the sale expired years ago. 18 million? His head was spinning. These are luxury homes. 47 of them, plus all the amenities. We bought the land for $75,000 at the tax sale. That's how these things work. $75,000 for 200 acres of prime Montana land. Something was very, very wrong. He left the clubhouse with copies of the documents, his mind racing. The drive back to town took 40 minutes, and he spent every minute of it thinking. His grandfather had called him about 6 months before he died. The old man had sounded stressed, worried about something. He'd said something about those people trying to take what's not theirs, but his words had been confused, hard to follow. At the time, he chalked it up to age and maybe the beginning of dementia. Now he wondered if his grandfather had been perfectly clear, and he just hadn't been listening. That evening, he checked into a motel in town and started going through the boxes of his grandfather's belongings that the estate lawyer had given him. Most of it was what you'd expect. Old photos, letters, his grandfather's veteran medals from Vietnam. But then he found a folder tucked in the bottom of one box. Inside were property tax receipts, every year going back decades, including receipts for the 5 years before the supposed tax sale. His grandfather had paid, every single year. On time, his hands were shaking again as he laid out the receipts on the motel bed. Proof, clear, dated proof that the tax sale was bogus. But if his grandfather had been paying, then how did the county claim there were unpaid taxes? There were other papers in the folder, too. Photocopies of county notices, but these looked different from the ones Whitmore had shown him. Different dates, different amounts, and there were handwritten notes in his grandfather's shaky handwriting. "They're lying," one note said. "Hayes is dirty. Whitmore paid him off. Sent me notice to wrong address, deliberate. Can't fight them alone, too old, too sick. Sorry." That last note broke something in him his grandfather had known. Had tried to fight, had been too weak and alone to win. And now, looking at these notes and receipts, he understood. This wasn't just some bureaucratic mistake. This was fraud. Organized, deliberate fraud. He sat on that motel bed until past midnight, his grandfather's notes spread around him. The old man had tried to protect the land, had fought as long as he could, had documented everything, hoping someone would find it and finish the fight. He thought about just walking away, going back to Seattle, back to his normal life. The legal battle would be expensive, exhausting. Whitmore clearly had money and connections. The local government seemed to be in on it, but then he picked up one more paper from the box, a letter sealed in an envelope with his name on it, his grandfather's handwriting. "If you're reading this, I'm gone. I tried to stop them but couldn't. The land has been in our family for over 100 years. Your great-great-grandfather built a life there with nothing but his hands and his will. Don't let thieves in suits take what generations of our family protected. I know I wasn't the grandfather you deserved. Let me leave you something worth fighting for. Make it right." He folded the letter carefully and put it in his pocket. Then he pulled out his laptop and started searching for lawyers in Montana who specialized in property fraud. They wanted a fight? He'd give them $1 by morning. He had a plan. First, he'd need a good lawyer. Second, he'd need to figure out exactly how deep this corruption went. And third, he'd need to be ready for Whitmore and whoever else was involved to come at him with everything they had. His grandfather couldn't finish this fight. But he could. The land was worth fighting for. Justice was worth fighting for. And maybe, just maybe, he owed the old man that much, plus finding a lawyer in a small Montana town who was willing to take on what looked like half the local government turned out to be harder than expected. The first three lawyers he called either said they were too busy or, after hearing Whitmore's name, suddenly remembered they had conflicts of interest. The fourth lawyer was different. Catherine Brennan ran a small practice on the edge of town, the kind of place where the sign outside was faded and the parking lot had more potholes than spaces. But when he walked in and explained the situation, her eyes lit up. "I've been waiting for someone to take a shot at Whitmore for years," she said, spreading his grandfather's documents across her desk. "That man is dirty as they come, but he's got protection. Half the county commission owes him favors." Over the next 2 weeks, they dug into everything. Catherine had connections at the county records office. People who didn't like how things were being run but were too scared to speak up alone. One clerk, a woman named Betty who'd worked there for 30 years, agreed to meet them after hours. "Hayes, the county clerk who processed that sale? He's Whitmore's guy," Betty told them in a whisper. "Even though the building was empty, I saw the paperwork come through." Something felt off about it, but Hayes pushed it through fast. Real fast. Didn't follow normal procedures. "What kind of procedures?" Catherine asked. "Normally, when someone's behind on property taxes, there's a process. Multiple notices over months. Publication in the newspaper. We try to track down the owner. For your grandfather's land, there was one notice sent to an address in Texas." "Your grandfather never lived in Texas, did he?" He shook his head. "Never. He lived on that land his whole adult life." Betty pulled out a file she'd hidden in her bag. "I made copies before Hayes could bury them. Look at this." The document showed the notice had been sent to an address in Houston. A completely random address. His grandfather's correct address was in the system, had been for decades. Someone had deliberately changed it. "Hayes changed the address?" Catherine asked. Betty nodded. "Had to be him. He's the only one with access to make that kind of change." "And look at the date of the sale. It was scheduled for a Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon. Tax sales are usually on Saturdays so working people can attend. This was deliberately set up so no one would be there to bid against Whitmore. The pieces were falling into place, but they needed more." Catherine filed a request for Hayes's financial records, which would take a court order. In the meantime, they started pulling county commission meeting minutes, looking for any connection between Whitmore and the commissioners who would have had to approve the sale. That's when things got interesting. And by interesting, he meant threatening. He was leaving the county records office one afternoon when a truck pulled up beside him in the parking lot. Two men got out, both big guys wearing Whitmore Construction Company shirts. "Mr. Whitmore wants you to know you're wasting your time," one of them said. "Everything was legal. Keep pushing, and you're going to make enemies you don't want. Is that a threat?" He tried to keep his voice steady. "It's friendly advice. Accidents happen to people who don't know when to quit." They got back in the truck and drove off. His hands were shaking so bad he could barely get his key in the car door. Catherine filed a police report, but the local sheriff was, surprise, surprise, one of Whitmore's golfing buddies. Nothing came of it. "We need to be careful," Catherine warned him. "Whitmore's not going to let this go quietly. But we're getting close to something. I can feel it." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A woman knocked on his motel room door one evening. She was in her 60s, fit, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "I'm Helen Torres," she said. "I live in Pinecrest. Can we talk?" He invited her in, suspicious but curious. She sat down and got straight to the point. "I'm retired FBI, moved here 3 years ago thinking it would be peaceful. Bought one of those houses in Pinecrest. But something's been bothering me about the HOA finances. They don't add up." She pulled out a folder of her own. "I started asking questions at HOA meetings. Wanted to see the detailed budgets, the construction contracts, where all our fees were going. Whitmore shut me down hard, sighed I was causing trouble. Some of my neighbors stopped talking to me." "What did you find?" he asked. "Look at this. Whitmore's construction company built Pinecrest, right? But he charged the HOA 40% above market rate for everything. Clubhouse that should have cost $300,000? He charged $500. The whole development was overpriced." "That's fraud on the HOA members," Catherine said. She'd come over as soon as he'd called her. "It gets better," Helen continued. I pulled Whitmore's business records. They're public. 5 years ago, his company was nearly bankrupt. Then suddenly, right after the tax sale, he had money flowing in, lots of it. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while he was in the middle of debugging code at his desk in Seattle. His grandfather had passed away. They hadn't been close for years, mainly because life got busy and Montana felt like a world away from the tech hub he called home. Still, the news hit harder than expected. 2 weeks later, he found himself driving down a long dirt road in rural Montana, surrounded by nothing but pine trees and mountains. His grandfather had left him something in the will. 2,000 acres of land that had been in the family since his great-great-grandfather first settled there in the 1890s. The leer on the phone had made it sound simple. But nothing about the next few hours would be simple. The GPS led him to what should have been untouched wilderness. Instead, he saw houses. Nice houses. The kind with perfect lawns, stone facades, and 3-car garages. There was even a fancy entrance gate with a sign that read, Pinecrest Estates, a premier mountain community. He pulled over and just stared. This couldn't be right. He checked the property maps the lawyer had sent him. The coordinates matched. This development was sitting right on land that supposedly belonged to him now. Actually, had belonged to his grandfather for decades. His heart started pounding as he drove through the gate. A security guard waved him through without asking questions. The place looked like something out of a luxury magazine. Tennis courts. A clubhouse with floor-to-ceiling windows. He counted at least 40 homes. Maybe more. He parked in front of the clubhouse and sat there for a minute, trying to figure out what to do. Call the lawyer? Call the police? Just go knock on someone's door and ask what the hell was going on? Before he could decide, a man in his 60s came walking out of the clubhouse. Khaki pants, expensive polo shirt, the kind of guy who definitely ran the HOA. He knocked on the car window. Can I help you? This is a private community. He got out of the car, his hands shaking slightly. I think there's been some kind of mistake. This land belongs to my family. My grandfather just died and left it to me. The man's expression changed from suspicious to something else. Not quite a smirk, but close. Oh, you must be the grandson. We heard someone might come around. I'm Donald Whitmore, HOA president. Why don't you come inside? We should talk. Inside the clubhouse, Whitmore pulled out a folder that looked like it had been prepared and waiting. Your grandfather, rest his soul, had some tax problems. County sold the land 5 years ago for unpaid property taxes. We purchased it fair and square at a county auction. Everything's legal and documented. Catherine leaned forward. How much? Well, the land only cost $75,000 at the sale. But he got $18 million in construction loans to build Pinecrest. That's a huge loan on a very small investment, unless he had a way to make the land worth more than $75,000, Catherine finished. If he could show plans for development, environmental clearances already done, then banks would loan against the future value, not the purchase price, which means he planned this way in advance, he said. This wasn't opportunistic. He targeted my grandfather's land specifically. Over the next few days, they kept digging. Catherine's court order came through, and Hayes's financial records told a damning story. 5 years ago, right before the tax sale, Hayes had deposited $50,000 in cash into his account. He'd claimed it was an inheritance, but there was no record of anyone dying and leaving him money. They found more. Whitmore and Hayes had taken a fishing trip together 2 months before the sale. Whitmore had paid for everything. They found emails between Whitmore and the county commission chairman about investment, opportunities that came with significant returns for forward-thinking public servants. The whole thing was a conspiracy, a well-planned, organized theft of land worth millions, dressed up as a legal tax sale, but having evidence and being able to use it were different things. The local authorities were compromised. The sheriff wouldn't investigate. The district attorney was Whitmore's former law partner. We need to go higher, Catherine said. State attorney general. FBI maybe. But that's going to take time. Months, maybe years. These investigations move slow. I don't have years, he said. Every day that passes, Whitmore's covering his tracks. Helen spoke up. There might be another way. A faster way. But it's aggressive. I'm listening. If the original sale was fraudulent, then legally you still own that land. All of it, including everything built on it. Catherine's eyes widened. You want to put liens on the properties? Not just liens, Helen said. He could claim ownership of the improvements. The houses? If the sale was fraudulent, then Whitmore built 47 houses on land he never legally owned. That makes them mine, he finished. The houses are legally mine. Catherine was quiet for a long moment. It's risky. Really risky. But it would force Whitmore's hand. He'd have to fight it in court, and that would bring everything into the open. He couldn't keep it quiet anymore. What about the people living there? He asked. The families who bought those houses? They didn't know about the fraud. That's the complicated part, Catherine admitted. Legally, their claim to the property is only as good as Whitmore's claim. If he never owned it, he couldn't sell it to them. So they could lose everything? Helen nodded. Some of them, yeah. But some of those families knew exactly what was going on. Whitmore's friends, his business partners, they got sweetheart deals on those houses. But others, they're innocent victims in this too. He thought about his grandfather, spending his last months knowing his land was stolen, too weak to fight. He thought about the threatening visit in the parking lot. He thought about generations of his family who'd protected that land. Let's do it, he said. File the liens. Claim the properties. Force this into the open. Catherine nodded slowly. Okay, but once we do this, there's no going back. Whitmore's going to come at us with everything he has. Good, he said. I'm tired of being the one who's scared. The next morning, Catherine filed a lawsuit in state court claiming the tax sale was fraudulent and demanding the return of all property, including improvements. She also sent copies of all their evidence to the state attorney general's office and to a journalist she knew at the biggest newspaper in Montana. By noon, the news was spreading through Pinecrest like wildfire. By evening, it had hit the state news. HOA built on stolen land, family fights back. His phone started ringing. Other residents from Pinecrest, scared and angry. Reporters wanting comments. Catherine's office was flooded with calls, and somewhere he knew. Whitmore was making calls of his own. The war had begun. The story hit the news like a bomb going off. Within 48 hours, it had gone from a local Montana paper to national coverage. Reporters camped outside Pinecrest's fancy entrance gate. Network news vans blocked the streets. The headline everyone was running with was basically the same. Luxury development built on land allegedly stolen from dying veteran. The public relations nightmare was exactly what Catherine had hoped for. You could corrupt a small-town sheriff, but you couldn't control what happened when the whole country was watching. Whitmore tried to get ahead of it. He held a press conference on the clubhouse steps, surrounded by lawyers. These allegations are completely false, he said, his voice steady but his hands gripping the podium a little too tight. We followed every legal procedure. This is a shakedown attempt by someone who waited too long to challenge a legitimate sale. But the reporter who'd first broken the story wasn't buying it. Mr. Whitmore, can you explain why the tax sale notice was sent to an address in Texas when the property owner lived in Montana for 50 years? That's a question for the county clerk's office. The county clerk who went on a fishing trip you paid for 2 months before the sale? Whitmore's lawyer stepped in then, ending the press conference. But the damage was done. The questions were out there, and they weren't going away. 3 days after the lawsuit was filed, federal agents showed up at the county building. The state attorney general had kicked it up to the FBI. Hayes, the county clerk, was arrested on suspicion of fraud and bribery. They walked him out in handcuffs while news cameras rolled. He watched it happen from Catherine's office. Hayes looked smaller somehow, his face gray and scared. Part of him felt bad for the guy. Then he remembered his grandfather's notes. The old man dying while these people stole his legacy. The sympathy didn't last long. Hayes will flip, Catherine predicted. Guys like that always do. He'll give up Whitmore to save himself. She was right. 2 days later, Hayes's lawyer reached out to the FBI with a deal. Hayes would testify about everything in exchange for a reduced sentence. And according to Catherine's sources, everything was a lot. The county commission chairman resigned. Then 2 more commissioners. The dominoes were falling, but inside Pinecrest, things were getting ugly. The residents were divided into 2 camps, and the line between them was getting nastier every day. Helen kept him updated on what was happening inside the community. She'd become his eyes and ears there, even though it was making her life difficult. Half the residents are scared they're going to lose their homes, she told him over coffee. They're the ones who bought in good faith, had no idea about the fraud. They've got mortgage, kids in the local schools. They're victims in this too. And the other half? They knew. Maybe not all the details, but they knew something was wrong. Whitmore's business partners, the county commissioner who lives on Maple Drive, the lawyer who helped process the sales. They got their houses for way below market value. They're the ones fighting hardest to keep everything buried. Can you tell which ones are which? Helen pulled out a list. I've been keeping track. 31 families who I think are genuinely innocent. 16 who definitely knew or should have known. The rest I'm not sure about yet. He studied the list. Real people? Real families. Kids who'd be affected by what happened next. This is a mess. Yeah, Helen agreed. But it's not a mess you created. Whitmore did this. Not you. The preliminary hearing came 2 weeks later. Judge Raymond Blackwell, brought in from out of county specifically because every local judge was compromised. He was in his 70s, had a reputation for being tough but fair, and didn't seem impressed by Whitmore's expensive legal team. Catherine presented the evidence. The fake tax notices. Hayes's suspicious bank deposit. The fishing trip. The emails. Her grandfather's tax receipts proving he'd paid every year. It was damning, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. Whitmore's lawyers tried to argue that even if there was fraud, the statute of limitations had passed. The sale was 5 years ago. Too late to challenge it now. Judge Blackwell didn't buy it. If the sale was procured through fraud and the plaintiff's grandfather was deliberately prevented from receiving proper notice, then the statute of limitations never began to run. He can't be time-barred from challenging a fraud he was actively prevented from discovering. Then the judge looked at Whitmore. Mr. Whitmore, I'm issuing a preliminary ruling that the evidence suggests, on its face, that the tax sale was fraudulent. This court finds that the plaintiff is likely the rightful owner of the disputed land, including all structures built upon it. Final ruling pending the criminal investigation, but effective immediately. All properties in Pinecrest Estates are subject to ownership dispute. The courtroom erupted. Whitmore's lawyers were on their feet objecting. Reporters were rushing out to file stories. Several Pinecrest residents who'd attended the hearing were crying. Judge Blackwell banged his gavel. Furthermore, pending the final resolution. The defendant's assets are frozen. Mr. Whitmore, you are not to sell, transfer, or encumber any property or assets until this matter is resolved. Whitmore's face went red. For the first time, he looked genuinely scared. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed them. Catherine made a brief statement, professional and measured. But they wanted to hear from him. He'd been avoiding cameras, but Catherine had coached him. Keep it simple. Stay sympathetic. My grandfather was a Vietnam veteran who spent his life protecting the land his family built, he said. All I want is justice for him and fairness for everyone involved, including the families in Pinecrest who were deceived by Whitmore just like my grandfather was. That last part was important. Catherine had insisted on it. Show that he wasn't the bad guy here. That he understood innocent people were caught in the middle. It worked. The next day's headlines were much more favorable. Grandson seeks justice while pledging fairness to innocent homeowners. But the best news came a week later. Hayes had finished talking to the FBI, and the information was devastating. Whitmore hadn't just bribed Hayes, he'd bribed 2 county commissioners. He'd paid off the appraiser who'd valued the land. He'd even paid a local environmental consultant to fast-track the development. Permits that normally took months. The whole thing was a massive conspiracy involving at least 8 people and probably more. The FBI was looking at RICO charges, racketeering, the kind of charges that carried serious prison time. Whitmore's fancy legal team was still fighting, but they were losing ground. More dominoes fell. The appraiser was arrested. One of the commissioners cut a deal. Whitmore's construction company was raided by federal agents, who spent 2 days hauling out boxes of documents. And inside Pinecrest, the Civil War continued. The innocent families were trying to organize, talking about suing Whitmore for fraud. Helen was helping them, coordinating meetings. They wanted to negotiate with him, she said. Wanted a path forward that didn't end with them losing everything. The families who'd known about the fraud were quieter. Some had already put their houses up for sale, trying to get out before everything collapsed. But with the ownership dispute, no bank would write a mortgage on those properties. They were trapped. Whitmore himself had disappeared from public view. Rumors said he was at his cabin up north, drinking heavily and refusing to take calls. His wife had filed for separation. His adult kids weren't returning his messages. The man who'd been king of his little empire was watching it all burn down. Catherine scheduled a meeting with Helen and the group of innocent homeowners. 31 families, all terrified, all desperate for some kind of resolution. "What are you thinking?" Catherine asked him the night before the meeting. He'd been thinking about it constantly. His grandfather's letter kept running through his mind. Make it right. But what was right when innocent people were caught in the crossfire? "I want to offer them a deal," he said. "A real one. Fair prices, long-term leases, option to buy. I don't want to be the reason families lose their homes." "And the ones who knew?" His voice hardened. "They chose to profit from stealing my family's land. They can face the consequences." Catherine nodded. "Okay, let's make it happen. But we need to be smart about this. We offer the good deal to the innocent families. The guilty ones? They get nothing. What about Whitmore?" "Whitmore's going to prison," Catherine said flatly. "Hayes is already cooperating. The FBI has enough to bury him. His house, his assets, everything's frozen pending criminal trial. And when he's convicted, you'll be able to sue him for everything he has left." The meeting with the Pinecrest families was emotional. People cried. Some were angry at first, seeing him as the threat to their homes. But Helen had done good work preparing them. She'd explained that he wasn't the enemy. Whitmore was. He laid out his proposal. Long-term leases at fair rates with option to buy the homes at reasonable prices over time. They'd keep their houses. Keep their community. Just under new ownership. "Why would you do this?" One woman asked. "You could probably force us all out and redevelop the whole thing yourself." "Because you didn't steal my grandfather's land," he said simply. "Whitmore did. You bought houses thinking everything was legal. That's not your fault." The relief in the room was palpable. People started asking questions about terms, about prices, about timelines. Catherine handled most of it, but the mood had shifted from fearful to hopeful. Not everyone was happy. Some of the families who'd been friendly with Whitmore were furious. They tried to organize resistance, threaten more lawsuits, but they didn't have much ground to stand on. And everyone knew it. 2 months after the preliminary ruling, Whitmore was arrested. The FBI came for him at dawn at his cabin. Fraud, bribery, conspiracy, racketeering. The list of charges took 3 pages. He didn't make bail. "Too much flight risk," the judge said. "Too many assets hidden overseas that they were still tracking down." And just like that, the king of Pinecrest was sitting in a county jail cell, waiting for trial. Justice was slow. But it was coming. The trial took 8 months to finally happen, but when it did, it was spectacular. The prosecution brought in Hayes first, looking pale and broken in his orange jumpsuit. He laid it all out. How Whitmore had approached him 2 years before the tax sale with a proposal. How they'd identified the old man's land as perfect for development. How they'd deliberately changed the address in the system to make sure the tax notices went nowhere. "He gave me $50,000 in cash," Hayes testified. said it was just a down payment, that when the development was built, I'd get more. A lot more. Whitmore's lawyer tried to tear him apart on cross-examination, but Hayes had receipts, literally photos of documents, text messages, emails. The man had kept evidence of everything. Probably knowing this day would come eventually, the county commissioners who'd been bribed testified next. They'd already cut deals, so they had nothing to lose by being honest. Whitmore had paid them $20,000 each to fast-track the approvals and look the other way on the questionable tax sale. He said it was just business, one of them said, not meeting anyone's eyes. Said this was how things got done. That everyone did it. The environmental consultant. The appraiser. One by one, they took the stand. The picture they painted was of a man who corrupted an entire system to steal land worth millions. Whitmore's defense tried to argue that these were all convicted criminals trying to reduce their sentences by blaming him. But the evidence was overwhelming. Bank records, recorded phone calls that Hayes had made once he knew he was caught, a paper trail that stretched back years. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they came back, Whitmore, his face was already resigned. He knew, guilty on all counts. The judge set sentencing for 3 weeks later. In the meantime, Whitmore went back to jail while the legal team scrambled to prepare arguments for leniency. They wouldn't get much, but before the sentencing, there was another matter to settle. The civil case. The ownership of the houses. The future of PINECREST. Catherine had worked out the details with the innocent families. 31 of them would get long-term leases with reasonable terms and options to buy their homes over time. The paperwork was ready. The deals were fair. Everyone had agreed, but then there were the other 16 families. The ones who'd known, who'd gotten their houses at half price because they were Whitmore's friends or business associates, who turned a blind eye to the questions about how everything had happened so fast. Catherine laid out the options. You can fight it in court and probably lose. Or you can accept boats at fair market value and walk away clean. Your choice. Most of them took the bid out. They knew fighting was pointless, and at least this way they'd get something. They'd still profit, just not as much as they'd hoped, but 4 families refused. They hired lawyers and dug in, claiming they had no knowledge of any fraud, that they were innocent buyers just like the others. The problem was that the evidence said otherwise. Helen had pulled HOA meeting minutes where these same people had joked about getting insider deals. There were emails where they'd congratulated Whitmore on pulling it off. One of them had been at that fishing trip with Hayes. The judge wasn't sympathetic. You purchased homes at significantly below market value from land you knew or should have known was obtained through questionable means. You don't get to claim ignorance now that it's convenient. He ordered the properties foreclosed and put up for auction. The families had 60 days to vacate. The hardest part was watching them move out. Even knowing they'd been complicit, seeing families packing up their lives was tough. Kids crying because they had to leave their friends. Wives angry at husbands whose greed had cost them their homes, but then he'd remember his grandfather's letter. The old man dying while these people lived in luxury built on stolen land. The sympathy had limits. The auction happened on a cold Saturday in October. The 4 houses went for less than they were worth because of all the publicity. Whitmore's own house, the biggest one in Pinecrest, sold for half its appraised value. The buyer was actually one of the families who'd gotten screwed by Whitmore's overpriced construction, and Helen said there was poetic justice in that. All the money from the auctions went to him. Compensation for 6 years of illegal use of his family's land. It wasn't as much as the land was worth, but Catherine assured him they could still go after Whitmore's remaining assets. He's got money hidden, she said. Offshore accounts, property in other states. The FBI is tracking it down. When they seize it, you'll get your share. The sentencing hearing came 2 weeks later. Whitmore stood before the judge, his expensive suit hanging loose because he'd lost weight in jail. His lawyer made a plea for mercy. Talked about Whitmore's charitable work, his family, his age. The judge listened patiently, then looked at Whitmore. You corrupted public officials. You defrauded a dying veteran. You built an empire on stolen land and didn't lose a minute of sleep over it. This wasn't a mistake or a lapse in judgment. This was calculated, organized crime over multiple years. The sentence was 12 years in federal prison. Hayes got 8. The commissioners got between 3 and 7 years each, depending on their cooperation. The appraiser got 5. Whitmore's wife divorced him while he was awaiting transfer to federal prison. His kids sold the family business for pennies on the dollar to pay legal fees. Everything he'd built fell apart. Some people said the sentence was too harsh. That 12 years for a man in his 60s was essentially a life sentence. But most people, especially in Pinecrest, felt it was fair. He destroyed lives, Helen said. He stole from a dying man. He corrupted the government. 12 years isn't harsh. It's justice. The FBI eventually tracked down another $3 million in hidden assets. Whitmore had been siphoning money overseas for years, probably planning for the day he might get caught. It all got seized. And after the government took its cut, the rest came to him. He used some of it to improve Pinecrest. The clubhouse needed work that Whitmore had skimped on. The tennis courts were cracking. He fixed it all properly this time, hired good contractors, paid fair prices. The innocent families were grateful. He'd kept his promise. Their homes were secure. The terms were fair. Some of them had even started exercising their options to buy, saving up down payments. The community started to heal. The division between those who'd known and those who hadn't slowly faded as the guilty. Families moved out and new people moved in. People who bought their homes legally, knowing the history, choosing to be part of the community anyway. Helen became the new HOA president. She ran it honestly, transparently, the way it should have been run from the start. She organized community events, movie nights, potlucks. Slowly, Pinecrest started feeling less like a crime scene and more like a neighborhood, but there were still reminders. The empty lots where the 4 foreclosed houses had stood before being demolished. The entrance gate that someone had spray-painted "Built on Lies" on before it got cleaned. The way people got quiet when someone mentioned Whitmore's name. One evening, he drove out to the part of his land that hadn't been developed. The original 2,000 acres minus the 200 that Pinecrest sat on. He'd been trying to figure out what to do with it. He could sell it. Developers were calling constantly, offering millions. Or he could develop it himself. Make back everything and more, but standing there in the Montana wilderness, watching the sun set over the mountains, he thought about his great-great-grandfather, the man who'd first homesteaded this land, who'd built a life here with nothing but determination and faith. He thought about his grandfather, dying while trying to protect it, and he realized he didn't want to develop it, didn't want to sell it, wanted to protect it the way generations of his family had. He called Catherine the next day. I want to put most of the land in a conservation easement. Protect it permanently. No development, no mining, nothing. Just keep it wild. You'd be walking away from millions, she warned. I know. But it's what my grandfather would have wanted. What my great-great-grandfather would have wanted. Okay, Catherine said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. Let's make it happen. The paperwork took months, but eventually 1,500 acres went into permanent conservation. Protected forever. His family's legacy preserved not through development, but through preservation. He kept 300 acres for himself. The part where his grandfather's original cabin had stood, where his great-great-grandfather had first broken ground. That part was personal. Whitmore had taken 200 acres and tried to build an empire on theft and corruption. He was taking 1,500 acres and giving it back to the wild. He knew which approach his grandfather would have respected. More. 3 years had passed since that first phone call about his grandfather's death, and sometimes it felt like a different lifetime. He'd been a software engineer who barely thought about Montana. Now he split his time between Seattle and the land that had changed his entire life. The 300 acres he'd kept had become his project. The old cabin where his grandfather had lived was too far gone to save, but he'd found the original foundation where his great-great-grandfather's first homestead had stood. That's where he chose to build, not a mansion, not a monument to victory over Whitmore, just a solid, well-built cabin that honored the history of the place. He hired local contractors, paid them well, and was there for most of the construction, learning how to build, getting his hands dirty, understanding the land in a way he never had before. The cabin had 3 bedrooms, a wide porch that looked out over the mountains, and a stone fireplace built from rocks pulled from the property. Simple, honest. His girlfriend, now fiancée, had fallen in love with it immediately. "This place has good energy," she'd said the first time she visited. "You can feel the history here." Pinecrest had stabilized into something healthier than what Whitmore had created. Helen still ran the HOA, and she ran it like a community instead of a business opportunity. The families who'd stayed were good people. They'd organized work parties to maintain the common areas, started a community garden. The kids all knew each other. Some of the original 31 families had exercised their options to buy. Others were happy with the long-term leases. Either way, they had security. They had homes, and they had a landlord who actually cared about maintaining the property properly instead of squeezing every dollar out of it. He'd even become friends with some of them. There was Mike, who bought in just months before everything blew up and had been terrified of losing his daughter's college fund. Now he and Mike went fishing sometimes, talking about anything except the drama that had brought them together. There was Jennifer, who'd been a single mom when she bought her house and had cried when he'd offered her the lease deal. She'd since remarried, and they'd invited him to the wedding. These were real people whose lives had been disrupted by Whitmore's greed. Helping them find stability again felt right in a way that just taking the money and running never would have. The conservation easement on the 1,500 acres had attracted attention from environmental groups. They'd written articles about it, used it as an example of private conservation done right. A few times a year, he'd allow guided nature walks on the property, letting people see what Montana wilderness looked like when it wasn't being developed. His grandfather would have liked that, he thought. The old man had been a quiet environmentalist before it was trendy, had talked about being a steward of the land, not an owner, had understood that some things were worth more left alone than developed. The money from the auctions and the seizure of Whitmore's assets had been substantial, more than he'd ever expected. He'd used some to build the cabin, some to set up a scholarship fund for local students in his grandfather's name, and invested the rest conservatively. He didn't need to work anymore if he didn't want to, but he still did. Part-time consulting, working remotely from the cabin. He discovered he liked the balance. A few days a week thinking about code and systems, the rest of his time working on the land. Being part of the Montana community. Catherine had become a friend too. The fierce lawyer who'd taken on his case when no one else would. She'd gained a reputation from the Whitmore case, gotten some high-profile clients, but she still kept her small office on the edge of town. Still took cases from people who couldn't afford fancy lawyers. "You changed this town," she told him once over drinks. Before Whitmore went down, there was this sense that corruption was just how things worked, that powerful people could do whatever they wanted. "You proved that wrong." "We proved it wrong," he corrected. "You, Helen, Betty, all the people who stood up." But he knew what she meant. The Whitmore case had been a turning point. 2 county commissioners had been recalled. The sheriff had retired early rather than face questions about his relationship with Whitmore. New people had run for office promising transparency and accountability. The town wasn't perfect. Corruption didn't disappear overnight. But there was more scrutiny now. More citizens paying attention. The newspaper had hired an investigative reporter specifically to watch local government. Change was slow, but it was happening. Helen had become one of his closest friends in Montana. She still lived in Pinecrest, still kept an eye on things. But she also spent time on his 300 acres, hiking the trails he'd cleared, helping him plan where to put the memorial to his grandfather. "What about the cabin?" she asked one afternoon while they were walking the property. "The original one, I mean. Your grandfather's place." He'd been thinking about that. The cabin was gone, but the site was still there. marked by old foundation stones and a century-old pine tree his great-great-grandfather had planted. "I'm going to put a marker there," he said. "Something simple, just acknowledging what it was who lived there, what they protected." They ended up hiring a local stonemason to create a simple monument. It had the names of 4 generations of his family who'd lived on and protected the land. His great-great-grandfather who'd homesteaded it. His great-grandfather who'd expanded it. His grandfather who'd defended it. And his name, continuing the legacy. The dedication ceremony was small. Just Catherine, Helen, Mike, and a few others from Pinecrest, some local friends he'd made. He said a few words about family and legacy and protection. About how some things matter more than money. His fiancée squeezed his hand. She got it. She'd grown up in a city, never understood rural life until she'd come here. Now, she was already talking about which bedroom in the cabin would be the nursery, about raising kids who understood where their food came from and why wild places mattered. Sometimes he thought about Whitmore. The man was in year 3 of his 12-year sentence, serving time in a federal facility in California. He'd filed appeals, but they'd all been denied. His wife had remarried. His kids had changed their last name, wanting distance from his crimes. He didn't feel satisfaction thinking about it. Didn't feel revenge or pleasure in Whitmore's downfall. Mostly, he just felt sad that someone had been so consumed by greed that they'd destroyed their own life and hurt so many others, but he also knew that Whitmore had made his choices, had chosen corruption over honesty, theft over fairness. The consequences were earned, not cruel. One evening, sitting on his cabin porch watching the sunset, his fiancée beside him, he pulled out his grandfather's letter. He'd kept it all this time, the paper worn soft from being unfolded and read so many times. "I know I wasn't the grandfather you deserved. Let me leave you something worth fighting for. Make it right." He'd done that. Had fought the fight his grandfather couldn't finish. Had made it as right as it could be made. The innocent families in Pinecrest had their homes. The guilty had faced justice. The land was protected. The corruption had been exposed. But more than that, he'd found something he didn't know he was missing. Connection to his family's history. Purpose beyond just writing code and collecting a paycheck. A sense of place that went deeper than just owning property. His great-great-grandfather had built a life here with his hands. His grandfather had protected it with his last breath. Now it was his turn to be a steward of this legacy. To protect it for the next generation. His fiancée was already planning their wedding. They'd have it here, on the land, under the Montana sky. Start their life together in the place that had already transformed his. "You think our kids will care about all this?" she asked, reading his mind. "The history, the land, all of it?" "I don't know," he admitted. "But we'll tell them the stories. About their great-great-grandfather who homesteaded this land. About their great-great-grandfather who fought for it. About the man who tried to steal it and the people who stood up to him. That's a lot of history for kids." "Yeah," he smiled. "But it's good history. It's about protecting what matters. About standing up for what's right even when it's hard. Those are lessons worth passing down." She leaned against him, and they watched the sun disappear behind the mountains. In the distance, he could see the lights of Pinecrest starting to come on. A community that had survived corruption and come out stronger. People living their lives, raising their kids, building their futures on land that was finally, legally, rightfully where it should be. His phone buzzed. A text from Mike asking if he wanted to go fishing this weekend. Another from Helen about the next meeting where they'd vote on adding solar panels to the clubhouse. Normal life. Community life. The kind of life his grandfather had lived before Whitmore had disrupted it. He texted back quick replies, then put the phone away. The mountains were turning purple in the twilight. An elk called somewhere in the distance. The wind rustled through the pines his great-great-grandfather had walked among. This was what he'd fought for. Not just the land itself, but what it represented. Justice, legacy, the idea that some things matter more than profit. His grandfather's letter had promised him something worth fighting for. But what he'd found was something worth living for. Worth protecting. Worth passing down, the fight was over. The battle was won. Now came the better part. Building a life. Making memories. Becoming part of the long line of people who'd loved this land and kept it safe. He pulled his fiancée closer as the stars started appearing overhead. "Welcome home," he said quietly. Though he wasn't sure if he was talking to her or to himself, or to the generations of his family who'd walked this ground before him, maybe it didn't matter. Maybe home was big enough for all of them, the land his great-great-grandfather had claimed, the legacy his grandfather had protected, the justice he'd fought for, the future he was building. All of it, together, finally right, finally home.